These days, there is widespread conflict. People have strong opinions. Much of the conflict is somehow the child of fear. We're fearful. We're hanging on to things, and we're afraid of losing something that we consider very important. Let me discuss this slightly. We need dialogue. Dialogue is not an instrument to resolve differences. Dialogue is an instrument to allow differences. When we allow differences, we don't have to win. We don't have to overcome the other person. We don't have to convince the other person that we are right and they are wrong. So let me talk a little bit about this. In 1971, Leonard Bernstein's Mass was performed at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Arts in Washington, D.C. The Mass was requested by Jackie Kennedy, who was a friend of Leonard Bernstein, and Bernstein, keep in mind, writing a Catholic Mass. Bernstein was the child of Russian immigrant Jews, so he was a Jewish man and a very committed, devout Jewish man. But he had this extraordinary insight into understanding a spirituality that he expresses in his great work called The Mass. And this was performed in 1971 for the opening of the Arts Center in Washington. The Mass itself was extremely controversial. And part of it was that his advisor was Daniel Berrigan, a Jesuit priest, a huge anti-war activist at the time, very controversial fellow, but perhaps a prophet before his time. Bernstein's Mass is 2 hours long, no interruption, there's no intermission, and it has a cast of about 200. It's the Tridentine Mass. The Mass goes back to the Council of Trent in 1545. And therefore, it's in Latin, but there are parts of it in English and a few parts in Hebrew. The celebrant is the priest who does the Mass in Latin. There's a choir, a traditional choir, boys' choir, that sings the parts in Latin in response. And then there's a choir of the audience, so to speak, the street singers. And they are the ones that contest throughout the whole performance. They contest whatever is said in Latin, and they want a different version. They don't believe, they don't contribute to this, the traditional Mass. And so it goes on and on. We have a tension between the street people singing, looking for something different, and the tradition in the celebrant and in the liturgical boys' choir. And this goes on and on. And eventually, at the end of the great performance, the priest is carried around by a huge congregation, and they have him carried aloft in all the splendor of his vestments, his liturgical vestments, and he's carrying a chalice aloft. And then something extraordinary happens. The whole thing collapses and the stage goes dark. And when the light comes on, the priest is standing there just in blue jeans and a t-shirt, and he sings a solo to conclude the performance. But he looks at the broken glass from the glass chalice, broken into many, many pieces, and he has this comment. He said, "I never knew that broken glass could shine so brightly." When it was finished and when this performance was over, many of the American bishops were appalled at it. It was sacrilegious. And in some ways, perhaps it was. but it raised our alertness to it, and it became somewhat more respected and more accepted because Pope John Paul II, some years later, asked to have it performed at the Vatican. And that, in some respects, anointed it as something that has great value by way of a teaching. It does teach us not to be so certain about everything, that somehow we will grow if we're open, we'll grow if we're courageous, we'll see things that perhaps we would not see if we're embedded in an opinion that will not change. You might keep that in mind, because these days, certainty is a very dangerous condition. When you're certain, you can't grow. So whenever you run into conflict in opinion, be it religious or political or whatever, keep in mind that we will grow only when we're open to change.